When we speak about the Anglo-Saxon and Viking worlds, we often frame the story as one of clashing swords, burning monasteries, and heroic kings whose names survive in chronicles. Yet beneath those familiar narratives lies a quieter, more disturbing history, one that rarely makes it into popular retellings. It is the story of captured Viking queens and noblewomen, and what power, fear, and ideology compelled their captors to do to them. Not in moments of battlefield rage, but in calculated, systematic ways that many contemporaries considered more final than death itself. To understand this, we must first understand who Viking queens were. In the Norse world, elite women were not ornamental figures. Queens and noblewomen managed estates, controlled wealth, arranged alliances, and sometimes ruled as regents. They embodied dynastic legitimacy. Their marriages created political bonds. Their bloodlines justified kingship. A Viking queen was not merely the wife of a king. She was a living symbol of sovereignty. To capture her was to capture the soul of a rival kingdom. The Anglo-Saxons understood this very well. Their society, like the Norse, was deeply hierarchical, but it was structured around different values. Anglo-Saxon Christianity had fused Roman ideas of order, obedience, and moral discipline with Germanic power structures. In this worldview, a woman who embodied pagan authority was not just an enemy, she was a threat to cosmic order. Killing her outright could make her a martyr in memory. Letting her live, but stripping her of everything that made her who she was far more effective. One of the first acts imposed on captured Viking queens was erasure of identity. Names mattered deeply in Norse culture. Lineage, ancestry, and reputation were preserved through names repeated across generations and immortalized in poetry. Anglo-Saxon chroniclers often deliberately refused to record the names of captured Norse women. They became anonymous figures in records, the wife of, the widow of, or simply pagan woman. This was not an accident of history, it was a strategy. To remove a name was to remove honor, memory, and legacy. A woman without a name could not inspire loyalty or rebellion. Conversion was another weapon. Forced baptism was not merely a religious act, it was a declaration that the old gods were powerless. For a Viking queen, whose authority was intertwined with divine favor from Odin, Frey, or Thor, conversion meant the public collapse of her legitimacy. Chroniclers describe baptisms performed in enemy strongholds, before assembled courts, where the queen was compelled to renounce her gods and accept a faith associated with her captors. Refusal could mean harsher imprisonment. Acceptance meant living proof that the Norse gods had failed. Imprisonment itself was not a temporary condition. Unlike captured male nobles, who might be ransomed, exchanged, or executed, high-status women were often kept alive for decades. They were confined to monasteries, royal estates, or guarded households. These were not places of comfort. A monastery, especially for a pagan noblewoman, functioned as a cultural tomb. Language, clothing, rituals, and daily rhythms were alien. Silence replaced authority. Obedience replaced command. The woman who once presided over halls and feasts now lived under strict rules, her days measured by bells and prayers to a god she had not chosen. What made this fate worse than death was its permanence. In Norse belief, death in battle or with honor ensured entry into Valhalla, or at least remembrance among the living. But a queen who lived on in captivity existed in a kind of limbo. She could not return home. She could not rule. She could not die gloriously. She faded from the world while still breathing. Marriage was another tool of domination. Captured Viking queens were sometimes forcibly married into Anglo-Saxon noble families. These unions were political acts designed to neutralize claims to power. Through marriage, her bloodline was absorbed into that of her conquerors. Her children would be raised Anglo-Saxon, Christian, and loyal to a different identity. From the Anglo-Saxon perspective, this was victory without further war. From the Norse perspective, it was the extinction of a dynasty. These marriages were often framed by chroniclers as merciful alternatives to execution. But mercy is a matter of perspective. To be compelled into a union that erased one's people, gods, and future was a form of living annihilation. The queen's body became a site of political resolution, her personal will irrelevant. There was also the deliberate use of humiliation. Anglo-Saxon society placed heavy emphasis on proper female behavior as defined by Christian norms: modesty, obedience, silence. Viking elite women, by contrast, were known for their assertiveness, public presence, and influence. Forcing a queen into roles considered low status, servitude, enforced seclusion, or ritualized submission, was a way of rewriting her story. She was no longer a ruler fallen in battle, but a warning example of what happened to pagan pride. Importantly, this was not always driven by cruelty alone. It was driven by fear. Viking queens represented continuity. Even in defeat, they could inspire resistance. A queen remembered, honored, or mourned could become a symbol around which rebellion formed. The Anglo-Saxons sought to prevent this by ensuring that captured queens did not die dramatically or publicly. Instead, they vanished quietly. The chronicler's silence is itself evidence. Anglo-Saxon records are meticulous about victories, treaties, and kings. Their near-total neglect of the fates of captured Norse women suggests intentional omission. What is not written can be as telling as what is. These women were meant to disappear from history, their stories swallowed by institutions that prized order over memory. When we compare this fate to death, the distinction becomes stark. Death ends suffering, but it can preserve meaning. A fallen queen could be remembered in song, her story retold as tragedy or heroism. A living captive, stripped of identity and voice, left no such legacy. Her suffering was private, prolonged, and unrecorded. It is tempting to imagine medieval violence only in physical terms, but psychological and cultural destruction were equally powerful. The Anglo-Saxons mastered this form of domination. By keeping Viking queens alive while dismantling everything they represented, they sent a message to both Norse and Saxon audiences: resistance would not be glorified, and survival would not guarantee dignity. This practice also reinforced Anglo-Saxon internal order. By demonstrating control over elite foreign women, kings and nobles affirmed their authority at home. The queen who once embodied another world now served as proof that only one world would prevail. In the end, the tragedy of these women lies not only in what was done to them, but in how effectively it worked. Their stories are fragments, shadows in hostile texts, absences where voices should be. They remind us that history is often written not just by the victors, but by those who decide who is allowed to be remembered. So when we ask what the Anglo-Saxons really did to captured Viking queens, the answer is not found in tales of execution or battlefield slaughter. It is found in silence, in erased names, in forced lives that continued long after meaning had been stripped away. For a culture that valued honor, memory, and legacy, this was a fate more devastating than death. The deeper we look, the clearer it becomes that this treatment was not an isolated phenomenon, but part of a broader strategy of cultural conquest. Anglo-Saxon rulers were not only fighting Viking armies, they were fighting Viking memory. And memory, especially in Norse society, was power. Sagas, genealogies, and oral poetry ensured that even fallen rulers lived on in collective consciousness. A dead queen could be transformed into legend. A living queen who was silenced could not. This is why so many captured Viking queens were deliberately removed from public view. They were relocated far from former strongholds, sometimes to the southern reaches of England, sometimes across the sea to religious houses with no Norse presence at all. Distance itself was a form of control. Cut off from familiar language and kinship networks, these women lost the ability to influence events even indirectly. Isolation ensured that no loyal followers could rally around them, no bards could preserve their words, and no children raised among their people could inherit their identity intact. Language loss was another invisible punishment. Old Norse and Old English were related but not mutually fluent. Over time, forced immersion meant that a queen's native tongue faded. With it went her ability to think, remember, and dream in the language of her ancestors. Modern psychology tells us that language shapes identity. To lose one's mother tongue is to lose part of oneself. For a Viking queen whose authority depended on storytelling, negotiation, and public speech, this loss was devastating. The Anglo-Saxons understood symbolism as well as the Norse did. Clothing, for example, carried deep cultural meaning. Norse elite women wore distinctive jewelry, brooches, arm rings, necklaces, that signified rank and family affiliation. Upon capture, these items were confiscated. Sometimes they were melted down, sometimes redistributed, sometimes placed in church treasuries as offerings. The queen's body, stripped of its symbols, was rendered politically neutral. She might still live, but she no longer visually represented power. Hair, too, mattered. In Norse culture, hair could signify status, beauty, and adulthood. Christian norms often required women to cover or cut their hair as a sign of modesty. Forcing a queen to adopt this practice was another form of erasure. It transformed her outward appearance into something unrecognizable to her former people. If she were ever seen again, she would no longer look like a queen of the north. There is also evidence, indirect but compelling, that some captured queens were used as living trophies. They were paraded at courts, introduced as examples of conquered paganism. This was not done openly or crudely, but subtly. Their presence communicated victory more effectively than banners or speeches. The message was clear: even those born to rule among the Vikings could be subdued, reshaped, and absorbed. What makes this particularly haunting is the emotional endurance required of these women. Imagine the psychological strain of remembering a past life of authority while living in constant submission. Every prayer spoken in a foreign faith, every rule enforced by unfamiliar customs reinforced the loss. And yet, suicide was not an easy option. Christianity condemned it, and monasteries were structured to prevent it. Survival was mandatory. Endurance became a form of imprisonment. Some queens may have outwardly embraced their new roles. Chroniclers occasionally describe pagan noblewomen who became pious Christians. But we must read these accounts carefully. Medieval writers often interpreted compliance as conversion of the heart. In reality, compliance was often the only way to reduce suffering. The line between genuine belief and enforced performance is impossible to draw from hostile sources. There is also the matter of motherhood. For queens who bore children after capture, the pain took on another dimension. Their sons and daughters were raised in a culture that denied half their heritage. These children were taught to revere saints instead of ancestors, kings instead of clan leaders. A mother watching her children grow into strangers, speaking another language, worshipping another god, loyal to another identity, experienced a slow, daily grief that no execution could match. In some cases, children were deliberately removed from their mothers and fostered elsewhere. Fosterage was common in Anglo-Saxon society, but here it served a darker purpose. It ensured that even maternal influence could not preserve Norse identity. The queen's role was reduced to biological function, her cultural influence severed. The silence of archaeology reinforces this narrative. While Viking graves often contain rich goods and clear markers of identity, the graves of high-status Norse women in Anglo-Saxon territories are conspicuously rare. This suggests that many never received burial rites consistent with their origins. If they died in captivity, they were buried as Christians, under Anglo-Saxon names, their past erased even in death. Their bones rest beneath markers that do not tell their true stories. We should also consider how gender shaped these outcomes. Male Viking leaders were dangerous because of what they could do. Female leaders were dangerous because of what they represented. A king could be killed to end a threat. A queen embodied continuity, bloodline, legitimacy, future claims. The Anglo-Saxon solution was not to end her life but to end her meaning. This tactic proved effective. Over generations, Viking resistance in England transformed. The Old Norse elite faded, absorbed into Anglo-Saxon nobility, or eliminated through marriage and conversion. The disappearance of Viking queens from the historical record was not accidental. It was the result of a deliberate campaign to neutralize symbols of sovereignty. Yet, in some ways, this very absence is a form of testimony. The gaps in the record, the nameless women, the unexplained disappearances, they point to a reality too uncomfortable for medieval chroniclers to fully articulate. Violence that leaves scars can be recorded. Violence that erases identity leaves only silence. When modern audiences romanticize the Viking Age, they often imagine fearless shield maidens and powerful queens. While such figures did exist, their stories rarely include what happened after defeat. The truth is less cinematic and more disturbing. Power did not always end in a blaze of glory. Sometimes it ended in a quiet room, a changed name, and a life lived under rules designed to ensure forgetting. And this is why, for many Viking queens, survival was worse than death. Death would have preserved their story. Survival destroyed it. They became ghosts within their own lifetimes, watching the world move on without them, knowing that no saga would be sung in their honor. In recognizing this, we are not simply condemning the Anglo-Saxons as uniquely cruel. Their actions reflected a broader medieval understanding of power. Cultural domination was often more effective than slaughter. The true tragedy lies in how successful it was, and how completely it silenced those who endured it. Today, when we try to reconstruct these lives, we are piecing together echoes. We read between the lines of chronicles written by men who saw these women not as individuals, but as problems to be solved. In doing so, we give them something they were denied in life: recognition. Their suffering reminds us that history's greatest cruelties are not always loud. Sometimes they are deliberate, methodical, and wrapped in the language of mercy and order. And sometimes the worst fate is not to die, but to live long enough to be forgotten.